Chapter 52. The Albatross. Southeastward from the Cape, off the distant Crozets, a good cruising ground for right whalemen, a sail loomed ahead, the Goni, Albatross, by name. As she slowly drew nigh, from my lofty perch at the foremast head, I had a good view of that sight so remarkable to a tyro in the far ocean fisheries, a whaler at sea, and long absent from home. As if the waves had been fullers, this craft was bleached like the skeleton of a stranded walrus. All down her sides, this spectral appearance was traced with long channels of reddened rust, while all her spars and her rigging were like the thick branches of trees furred over with hoarfrost. Only her lower sails were set. A wild sight it was to see her long bearded lookouts at those three mastheads. They seemed clad in the skins of beasts, so torn and bepatched the raiment that had survived nearly 4 years of cruising. Standing in iron hoops nailed to the mast, they swayed and swung over a fathomless sea, and though, when the ship slowly glided close under our stern, we 6 men in the air came so nigh to each other that we might almost have leaped from the mastheads of one ship to those of the other, yet, those forlorn-looking fishermen, mildly eyeing us as they passed, said not one word to our own lookouts, while the quarter-deck hail was being heard from below. "Ship ahoy! Have you seen the white whale?" But as the strange captain, leaning over the pallid bulwarks, was in the act of putting his trumpet to his mouth, it somehow fell from his hand into the sea, and the wind now rising amain, he in vain strove to make himself heard without it. Meantime his ship was still increasing the distance between. While in various silent ways the seamen of the Pequod were evincing their observance of this ominous incident at the first mere mention of the white whale's name to another ship, Ahab for a moment paused. It almost seemed as though he would have lowered a boat to board the stranger, had not the threatening wind forbade. But taking advantage of his windward position, he again seized his trumpet, and knowing by her aspect that the stranger vessel was a Nantucketer and shortly bound home, he loudly hailed, "Ahoy there! This is the Pequod, bound round the world. Tell them to address all future letters to the Pacific Ocean. And this time 3 years, if I am not at home, tell them to address them to." At that moment the 2 wakes were fairly crossed, and instantly, then, in accordance with their singular ways, shoals of small harmless fish, that for some days before had been placidly swimming by our side, darted away with what seemed shuddering fins, and ranged themselves fore and aft with the stranger's flanks. Though in the course of his continual voyagings Ahab must often before have noticed a similar sight, yet, to any monomaniac man, the veriest trifles capriciously carry meanings. "Swim away from me, do ye?" murmured Ahab, gazing over into the water. There seemed but little in the words, but the tone conveyed more of deep helpless sadness than the insane old man had ever before evinced. But turning to the steersman, who thus far had been holding the ship in the wind to diminish her headway, he cried out in his old lion voice, "Up helm! Keep her off round the world!" "Mr. Radney, I will not obey you. Take that hammer away, or look to yourself." But the predestinated mate, coming still closer to him, where the lakeman stood fixed, now shook the heavy hammer within an inch of his teeth, meanwhile repeating a string of insufferable maledictions. Retreating not the 1,000th part of an inch, stabbing him in the eye with the unflinching poniard of his glance, Steelkilt, clenching his right hand behind him and creepingly drawing it back, told his persecutor that if the hammer but grazed his cheek he, Steelkilt, would murder him. But, gentlemen, the fool had been branded for the slaughter by the gods. Immediately the hammer touched the cheek. The next instant the lower jaw of the mate was stove in his head. He fell on the hatch spouting blood like a whale. Ere the cry could go aft Steelkilt was shaking one of the backstays leading far aloft to where 2 of his comrades were standing their mastheads. They were both canalers. "Canalers," cried Don Pedro. "We have seen many whale ships in our harbors, but never heard of your canalers." "Pardon, who and what are they?" "Canalers, Don, are the boatmen belonging to our Grand Erie Canal. You must have heard of it." "Nay, senor, hereabouts in this dull, warm, most lazy, and hereditary land, we know but little of your vigorous north. I? Well then, Don, refill my cup. Your chich is very fine, and ere proceeding further I will tell you what our canalers are, for such information may throw sidelight upon my story. For 360 miles, gentlemen, through the entire breadth of the state of New York, through numerous populous cities and most thriving villages, through long, dismal, uninhabited swamps, and affluent, cultivated fields, unrivaled for fertility, by billiard room and bar room, through the holy of holies of great forests, on Roman arches over Indian rivers, through sun and shade, by happy hearts or broken, through all the wide contrasting scenery of those noble Mohawk counties, and especially, by rows of snow-white chapels, whose spires stand almost like milestones, flows one continual stream of Venetianly corrupt and often lawless life. There's your true Ashanti, gentlemen, there howl your pagans, where you ever find them, next door to you, under the long-flung shadow, and the snug patronizingly of churches. For by some curious fatality, as it is often noted of your metropolitan freebooters that they ever encamp around the halls of justice, so sinners, gentlemen, most abound in holiest vicinities. Is that a friar passing? Said Don Pedro, looking downwards into the crowded plaza, with humorous concern. Well, for our northern friend, Dame Isabella's Inquisition wanes in Lima, laughed Don Sebastian. Proceed, senor. A moment. Pardon, cried another of the company. In the name of Allah Slimies, I but desire to express to you, Sir Sailor, that we have by no means overlooked your delicacy in not substituting present Lima for distant Venice in your corrupt comparison. Oh! Do not bow and look surprised, you know the proverb all along this coast, corrupt as Lima. It but bears out your saying, too, church is more plentiful than billiard tables, and forever open, and corrupt as Lima. So, too, Venice, I have been there, the holy city of the blessed evangelist, Saint Mark, Street Dominic, Purget. Your cup. Thanks, here I refill, now, you pour out again. Freely depicted in his own vocation, gentlemen, the canaler would make a fine dramatic hero, so abundantly and picturesquely wicked is he. Like Mark Antony, for days and days along his green-turfed, flowery Nile, he indolently floats, openly toying with his red-cheeked Cleopatra, ripening his apricot thigh upon the sunny deck. But ashore, all this effeminacy is dashed. The brigandish guise which the canaler so proudly sports, his slouched and gaily ribboned hat betoken his grand features. A terror to the smiling innocence of the villages through which he floats, his swart visage and bold swagger are not unshunned in cities. Once a vagabond on his own canal, I have received good turns from one of these canalers. I thank him heartily, would fain be not ungrateful, but it is often one of the prime redeeming qualities of your man of violence, that at times he has as stiff an arm to back a poor stranger in a strait, as to plunder a wealthy one. In sum, gentlemen, what the wildness of this canal life is emphatically evinced by this, that our wild whale fishery contains so many of its most finished graduates, and that scarce any race of mankind, except Sydney men, are so much distrusted by our whaling captains. Nor does it at all diminish the curiousness of this matter, that to many thousands of our rural boys and young men born along its line, the probationary life of the Grand Canal furnishes the sole transition between quietly reaping in a Christian cornfield and recklessly plowing the waters of the most barbaric seas. I see. I see, impetuously exclaimed Don Pedro, spilling his chicha upon his silvery ruffles. No need to travel. The world's one Lima. I had thought, now, that at your temperate north the generations were cold and holy as the hills do. But the story I left off, gentlemen, where the lakeman shook the backstay. Hardly had he done so, when he was surrounded by the 3 junior mates and the 4 harpooneers, who all crowded him to the deck. But sliding down the ropes, like baleful comets, the 2 canalers rushed into the uproar, and sought to drag their man out of it towards the forecastle. Others of the sailors joined with them in this attempt, and a twisted turmoil ensued. While standing out of harm's way, the valiant captain danced up and down with a whale pike, calling upon his officers to manhandle that atrocious scoundrel and smoke him along to the quarterdeck. At intervals, he ran close up to the revolving border of the confusion, and prying into the heart of it with his pike, sought to prick out the object of his resentment. But Steelkilt and his desperadoes were too much for them all. They succeeded in gaining the forecastle deck, where, hastily slewing about 3 or 4 large casks in a line with the windlass, these sea Parisians entrenched themselves behind the barricade. "Come out of that, ye pirates," roared the captain, now menacing them with a pistol in each hand, just brought to him by the steward. "Come out of that, ye cutthroats." Steelkilt leaped on the barricade, and striding up and down there, defied the worst the pistols could do, but gave the captain to understand distinctly that his, Steelkilt's, death would be the signal for a murderous mutiny on the part of all hands. Fearing in his heart lest this might prove but too true, the captain a little desisted, but still commanded the insurgents instantly to return to their duty. "Will you promise not to touch us, if we do?" demanded their ringleader. Turn to, I. Make no promise, to your duty. Do you want to sink the ship by knocking off at a time like this? Turn to, and he once more raised a pistol. "Sink the ship," cried Steelkilt. "Aye, let her sink. Not a man of us turns to, unless you swear not to raise a rope yarn against us. What say ye, men?" turning to his comrades. A fierce cheer was their response. The lakeman now patrolled the barricade, all the while keeping his eye on the captain, and jerking out such sentences as these: "It's not our fault, we didn't want it, I told him to take his hammer away, it was boy's business, he might have known me before this, I told him not to prick the buffalo, I believe I have broken a finger here against his cursed jaw, ain't those mincing knives down in the forecastle there, men? Look to those handspikes, my hearties. Captain, by God, look to yourself, say the word, don't be a fool, forget it all, we are ready to turn to, treat us decently, and we're your men, but we won't be flogged. Turn to. I make no promises, turn to, I say. Look ye, now, cried the lakeman, flinging out his arm towards him, there are a few of us here, and I am one of them, who have shipped for the cruise, D.C. Now as you well know, sir, we can claim our discharge as soon as the anchor is down, so we don't want a row, it's not our interest, we want to be peaceable, we are ready to work, but we won't be flogged. Turn to, roared the captain. Steelkilt glanced round him a moment, and then said, I tell you what it is now, captain, rather than kill ye, and be hung for such a shabby rascal, we won't lift a hand against ye unless ye attack us, but till you say the word about not flogging us, we don't do a hand's turn. Down into the forecastle then, down with ye, I'll keep ye there till you're sick of it. Down ye go. Shall we? Cried the ringleader to his men. Most of them were against it, but at length, in obedience to Steelkilt, they preceded him down into their dark den, growlingly disappearing, like bears into a cave. As the lakeman's bare head was just level with the planks, the captain and his posse leaped the barricade, and rapidly drawing over the slide of the scuttle, planted their group of hands upon it, and loudly called for the steward to bring the heavy brass padlock belonging to the companionway. Then opening the slide a little, the captain whispered something down the crack, closed it, and turned the key upon them, 10 in number, leaving on deck some 20 or more, who thus far had remained neutral. All night a wide-awake watch was kept by all the officers, forward and aft, especially about the forecastle scuttle and fore hatchway, at which last place it was feared the insurgents might emerge, after breaking through the bulkhead below. But the hours of darkness passed in peace, the men who still remained at their duty toiling hard at the pumps, whose clinking and clanking at intervals through the dreary night dismally resounded through the ship. At sunrise, the captain went forward, and knocking on the deck, summoned the prisoners to work, but with a yell, they refused. Water was then lowered down to them, and a couple of handfuls of biscuit were tossed after it, when again turning the key upon them and pocketing it, the captain returned to the quarter-deck. Twice every day for 3 days this was repeated, but on the 4th morning a confused wrangling, and then a scuffling was heard, as the customary summons was delivered, and suddenly 4 men burst up from the forecastle, saying they were ready to turn to. The fetid closeness of the air, and a famishing diet, united perhaps to some fears of ultimate retribution, had constrained them to surrender at discretion. Emboldened by this, the captain reiterated his demand to the rest, but Steelkilt shouted up to him a terrific hint to stop his babbling and betake himself where he belonged. On the fifth morning, 3 others of the mutineers bolted up into the air from the desperate arms below that sought to restrain them. Only 3 were left. "Better turn to, now," said the captain with a heartless jeer. "Shut us up again, will ye?" cried Steelkilt. "Oh certainly," said the captain, and the key clicked. It was at this point, gentlemen, that enraged by the defection of 7 of his former associates, and stung by the mocking voice that had last hailed him, and maddened by his long entombment in a place as black as the bowels of despair, it was then that Steelkilt proposed to the 2 Canallers, thus far apparently of one mind with him, to burst out of their hole at the next summoning of the garrison, and armed with their keen mincing knives, long, crescentic, heavy implements, with a handle at each end, run amuck from the bowsprit to the taffrail, and if by any devilishness of desperation possible, seize the ship. For himself, he would do this, he said, whether they joined him or not. That was the last night he should spend in that den. But the scheme met with no opposition on the part of the other 2, they swore they were ready for that, or for any other mad thing, for anything in short but a surrender. And what was more, they each insisted upon being the first man on deck, when the time to make the rush should come. But to this their leader as fiercely objected, reserving that priority for himself, particularly as his 2 comrades would not yield, the one to the other, in the matter, and both of them could not be first, for the latter would but admit 1 man at a time. And here, gentlemen, the foul play of these miscreants must come out. Upon hearing the frantic project of their leader, each in his own separate soul had suddenly lighted, it would seem, upon the same piece of treachery, namely, to be foremost in breaking out, in order to be the first of the 3, though the last of the 10, to surrender, and thereby secure whatever small chance of pardon such conduct might merit. But when Steelkilt made known his determination still to lead them to the last, they in some way, by some subtle chemistry of villainy, mixed their before secret treacheries together, and when their leader fell into a doze, verbally opened their souls to each other in 3 sentences, and bound the sleeper with cords, and gagged him with cords, and shrieked out for the captain at midnight. Thinking murder at hand, and smelling in the dark for the blood, he and all his armed mates and harpooneers rushed for the forecastle. In a few minutes the scuttle was opened, and, bound hand and foot, the still struggling ringleader was shoved up into the air by his perfidious allies, who at once claimed the honor of securing a man who had been fully ripe for murder. But all these were collared, and dragged along the deck like dead cattle, and, side by side, were seized up into the mizzen rigging, like 3/4 of meat, and there they hung till morning. "Damn ye," cried the captain, pacing to and fro before them, "the vultures would not touch ye, ye villains." At sunrise he summoned all hands, and separating those who had rebelled from those who had taken no part in the mutiny, he told the former that he had a good mind to flog them all round, thought, upon the whole, he would do so, he ought to, justice demanded it, but for the present, considering their timely surrender, he would let them go with a reprimand, which he accordingly administered in the vernacular. "But as for you, ye carrion rogues," turning to the 3 men in the rigging, "for you, I mean to mince ye up for the trypots," and, seizing a rope, he applied it with all his might to the backs of the 2 traitors, till they yelled no more, but lifelessly hung there, heads sideways, as the 2 crucified thieves are drawn. "My wrist is sprained with ye," he cried, at last, "but there is still rope enough left for you, my fine bantam, that wouldn't give up. Take that gag from his mouth, and let us hear what he can say for himself." For a moment the exhausted mutineer made a tremulous motion of his cramped jaws, and then painfully twisting round his head, said in a sort of hiss, "What I say is this, and mind it well, if you flog me, I murder you." "Say ye so? Then see how ye frighten me," and the captain drew off with the rope to strike. "Best not," hissed the lakeman. "But I must," and the rope was once more drawn back for the stroke. Steelkilt here hissed out something, inaudible to all but the captain, who, to the amazement of all hands, started back, paced the deck rapidly 2 or 3 times, and then suddenly throwing down his rope, said, "I won't do it, let him go, cut him down, d'ye hear?" But as the junior mates were hurrying to execute the order, a pale man, with a bandaged head, arrested them, Radney the chief mate. Ever since the blow, he had lain in his berth, but that morning, hearing the tumult on the deck, he had crept out, and thus far had watched the whole scene. Such was the state of his mouth, that he could hardly speak, but mumbling something about his being willing and able to do what the captain dared not attempt, he snatched the rope and advanced to his pinioned foe. "You are a coward," hissed the lakeman. "So I am, but take that." The mate was in the very act of striking, when another hiss stayed his uplifted arm. He paused, and then pausing no more, made good his word, spite of Steelkilt's threat, whatever that might have been. The 3 men were then cut down, all hands were turned to, and, sullenly worked by the moody seamen, the iron pumps clanged as before. Just after dark that day, when one watch had retired below, a clamor was heard in the forecastle, and the 2 trembling traders running up, besieged the cabin door, saying they durst not consort with the crew. Entreaties, cuffs, and kicks could not drive them back, so at their own instance they were put down in the ship's run for salvation. Still, no sign of mutiny reappeared among the rest. On the contrary, it seemed that mainly at Steelkilt's instigation, they had resolved to maintain the strictest peacefulness, obey all orders to the